Who among us has used or heard the phrase, if something happens? What do you think that euphemism is there? If something happens. I know you know it. Well, if something happens, we want to make sure we have enough life insurance. Well, if something happens, we want to make sure we keep the house. If something happens, I have wanted for the longest time to have a conscious conversation about death and dying. It's a really tricky topic, isn't it, Conrad? It's very tricky, very slippery slope. And I'm interested in seeing if we can normalize the conversation. Like, say words out loud and say what we mean. Now, I'm sure you've heard these common terms in Unity. They've made their transition. Who's heard that phrase? Or they're making their transition. They are, in the words of Rev Erin, lifting off the planet into freedom form. That's a beautiful visual. My favorite, they've left the planet. In fact, the first sentence in my obituary is, Reverend Brenda left the planet right on time. Maybe one of the 2 or 3 times in my life I will have been on time. They passed away. They died. Sometimes people say that. And my least favorite, graduated. I had a minister that used that term, and it just always felt off to me. Graduated, okay. So we have this euphemism, great word, euphemism, if something happens. And that phrase intrigues me the most because it contains the most avoidance and maybe denial. And here's the thing, my research shows that death is an inevitable event in our human existence. Does anybody know differently? So there's no if, it's when. I just feel like the oxygen went out of the room. Can everybody just have a breath? So how can we get more open to speaking about death? We're taking a dive in this morning, and we'll see what happens. We'll see where we land. So what I've noticed is often, let's say you are a quote unquote terminal patient. The loved ones around you might likely be making the assumption that we are not going to talk about it. We don't want to talk about the something. And I find that's pretty common. And then on the other hand, in my role, and actually before I got here, I feel like this is just flopping all over. Whenever I've raised the conversation, people always want to talk about it. They just don't know how to get the door open. So I'd like to start this morning with the business end of something happening, because I'm so pragmatic. Another thing that I've observed, particularly after someone has left the planet, is that most people don't consider that the lack of discussion and the lack of planning leaves a huge complicated burden on the ones that are left behind. I watch people who are still numb, still in shock, and making these huge critical decisions. Or one person says she wanted to be embalmed and buried. Another person says she told me she wanted to be cremated. And somebody else saying, well, I think embalming and burial is better. And I'm sitting there clenching my teeth because I want to say, well, I think cremation is better. But if we haven't talked about it, we have a lot of people guessing. So I just invite us to open the conversation in whatever way we can. Who here has thought about and discussed arrangements for end of life? Oh, thank you, Jesus. That is so great. Thank you. And for the rest of you, again, it's an open invitation. Have you talked about organ donation? Is that your loved one's wish? Have you talked about body donation? You know, like for research, for scientific and medical research. Have you talked about cremation? Have you talked about embalming and burial? Have you talked about embalming in the environment? So the next thought was, how about preferences for your service? Do you want like a formal service? Do you want just an informal social gathering? People get together and trade stories and you have a little bit to nosh on. Some people like just a very private family, close ones type of gathering. So let's talk about that. How would you want it to be? And you know what? A few people, not many in my experience, but a few people have had a loved one graduate, and that person wanted nothing. You know, no nothing, like no obituary, no service, no, and that's really tricky on the ones left behind. Because it's an opportunity, you know, for closure. So, while, like I mentioned before, while we're in this numb state of shock, we're making these vital and often very expensive decisions. And I'll just add a personal note on that body donation. I have a family member who chose that route, and here's how it works. You fill out the paperwork with the university, so you have the arrangements done. After the person leaves the planet, not before, but after the person leaves the planet, you call the team, and they come and retrieve the body. They take it to the university. They do their program with it, which in our experience took about a year. And then they have a cremation there, and they send the ashes to the family, and there is zero cost, just FYI, for our environmental and financial steward peeps. So before we even get to any of that, anybody familiar, or do you have living will or healthcare directive? Oh, that's so good. Because in the event that we are rendered unconscious, in the event that we're rendered, non-speaking, incapable of communicating or making decisions, we have named a trusted person to be that voice for us. And the directives are all on the form. So once again, very, very, very helpful document. Should be on file with your general practitioner, and it should be on file at your preferred hospital. Okay? Living will, they're slightly different documents, so check them out. Living will and healthcare directive. And the obituary, yes, I have written mine. I wrote mine after I wrote one for my father. A few years later, one for my mother. A few years later, one for my brother. A few years later, one for my sister. And it's tricky to come up, with whatever you want in there, all the history, all the detail. So I did sit down and write mine. I shared it with a journalist friend who will get it to a newspaper. It can be updated. much quicker and more easily than writing from scratch. So now let's get into the dying process. And, I will say, I haven't thought about the odds or the percentages. Clearly, I have been with many people who made a very sudden transition. And I've been with people who were diagnosed terminally and took a longer time. I don't think there's a best way to go about this. I think that's up to our soul journey. I do know everyone's prayer is, let it be quick. And that's a huge shock for the peeps left behind. But there's that. So I was with this congregant who had come to see me. She had a terminal diagnosis, and I visited with her regularly for spiritual support. And in one of our conversations, I said, "What is your biggest fear?" And she thought a moment, and she said, it's not death or what happens after, it's the getting there. She said, "I don't want to suffer, and I don't want to be in pain." And that brings us to the topic of, some people call it comfort care, some people call it palliative care, some people call it hospice. And I'm a huge advocate of these programs. They have so many services that are supportive for the patient and for the family members. I have a book in my bag. It's a black and white cover, and it says Dying Well. And it's written by Dr. Ira Byock. It was written in, I think, the late 90s. He's the founder of hospice programs in our country. And his book is many, many, many case studies of patients, of medical staff, and of caregivers. It's very interesting. And at the beginning of the book, he shares the story of his father's, he's a physician, and his father is ill. And so he writes about the medical care. And his dad lived on the East Coast, and the doctor and his family lived out west. And the dad had planned to die in a hospital in New Jersey. And as he got closer to death, the family started having conversations about what mattered. Our relationship, our love, our forgiveness of one another, and what did Dad really want for final plans. Now, the son, the doctor, his wife, and the doctor's mother, the patient's wife, really wanted him to stay out west and be in the doctor's home so that the family could take care of him. And finally, the dad stepped into vulnerability. Here's another line that's very common: "I don't want to be a burden." Has anybody here been a caretaker for a terminally ill patient? Is it a gift? Is it a gift? It's a hard road, and it's a precious gift. And so what the doctor told his father was, "Dad, you are giving us a tremendous gift to allow us to care for you." So he writes about that. I think hospice care is completely misunderstood and way underutilized. People don't like the term hospice because they think it means death. And yes, ultimately, eventually, it does. But the point of the hospice care team, and it's a large team, they assist us in the getting there. They offer medication. They're really great at pain management, managing suffering. They offer spiritual support. They offer physical help with your daily activities of living, massage therapy, music therapy, social workers. volunteers to be with your family, to support them and you. Ira, in his book Dying Well, wrote, "We can each have a role in the dying process by insisting that the wishes of our loved ones are respected, that expert medical care is brought to bear, that physical distress is eased, and that they are cared for in a dignified way." And he went on to say, ultimately, a durable resolution to end-of-life dilemma will require transformation at the deepest level of American culture. Now, Byock was putting together a hospice program in, I think it was the early 80s. He wrote his book in the late 90s. And in those days, entirely different culture. And one woman, I'm pretty sure you've heard her name, at the forefront of blowing open the doors to this cultural transformation is Dr. Elizabeth Kubler Ross. You've heard of her. She's a prolific writer. And her practice was about dying and death. So when she first, in the 1960s, when she first got her role in a hospital, what came about was interviewing these terminal patients and finding out what they wanted. She was not well received by the medical staff in the hospital. They thought she was haunting the halls for someone to interview, like sort of the Grim Reaper, and death was a taboo subject. That's because in medical training, doctors are trained to avoid death, to forestall it as long as possible. One more treatment, one more procedure, one more medication. So Kubler-Ross wrote, "Death has always been distasteful to humankind. And this can best be explained by our basic knowledge that in our unconscious, death is never possible in regard to ourselves." Isn't that an interesting thought? Like in the unconscious, how can that, thus comes the phrase if, because I don't see it happening. And she says it's inconceivable for our unconscious to imagine an actual ending to our life here on earth. Until I read Ross, I never heard anyone say this. Death is the easiest thing we'll ever do. It's life that's a struggle. That's a double-edged something. So she worked with tens of thousands of dying patients, and she cooks all the wisdom down to this. Live so that we don't look back and regret that we've wasted our life. Live so we don't regret the things we've done or wish we had acted differently. Live honestly, live fully, live. And that's what hospice and long-term dying care is about, is living to the very best, to the very end. Is anybody as fascinated with near-death experiences as I am? I think they're so interesting. There's a section in Ross's book about those. This is in the early 70s. She interviewed over 20,000 people, and here's the conclusions from these people who reported near-death experience. The death experience is pain-free. This is, we have left the planet. We have stepped through the veil. The death experience is pain-free. People did not want to come back to this earthly experience. And this all led Ross to a scientific conclusion. Brace yourselves. death does not exist. She said, we have a soul, we have a spirit, we have a higher reason for life. She also gives us some idea of the 4 phases when people have been on the other side of the veil. First step, out of body. We're still in the area, as it were. We're still in the hospital room. We're still in the room in a home, wherever we are, in a facility, in the car, in a car crash. And we're out of body, and we're witnessing in great detail what is happening. We know who is there. We hear what they say. We know what their experience is. So that lasts for a period of time. And then phase 2, we become this spirit energy, like formless. And we can zoom all over the planet because we are aware of beloveds and loved ones who are in shock and who are grieving. And we can go to be with them in that moment. And then our guide takes us, still on the other side of the veil, to our previously deceased loved ones. And it's not form, but it's a sense of knowing and recognizing those souls. It's a very joyous reunion. And step 3, we get to go through the transition tunnel. You know, they talk about the tunnel a lot. And we experience the intense light and energy of divine love. I have seen interviews of people who've been with a dying patient, and the patient kind of goes in and out for a bit. And at one point, the patient shoots up in bed and says to Sharon Stone, "It's so beautiful there. It's all about love." So at that time, we've been in the presence of nothing but pure love. And we get the life review. I can't wait. In that life review, we get to see who we were and how we were in this earthly experience, how our words, our actions impacted others. And then she says there was a final question by the guides to the soul. What service have you rendered? That's a contemplation, a meditation contemplation. What service have we rendered? I want to touch on one other sage, and that is my Thich Nhat Hanh, a renowned Buddhist monk. And he has several Dharma talks on life and death on YouTube. Check them out. Some are short little snippets, and some are, you put them in and you go to sleep and you get the message. And Thich Nhat Hanh teaches about no life, no death. It's a mind-blowing Dharma talk. He goes into it very, very deeply and sharing wisdom. I've listened to it several times, sharing wisdom I hadn't previously heard. And one thing that Thai taught is birth and death are but 2 sides of one door. We go in and we go out. And as what we see on this plane, what we call dying, is the soul birthing itself into another dimension, the next life experience, the mystery. And Byock, the hospice doctor, also likens the dying process to a birthing, a laboring out of our skin suits. I had that experience on my birthday in 2013 with my sister. I sat with her through the night. I was holding her hand and stroking her head, and it occurred to me while she was in the process, I was very present, and it occurred to me that her breathing, that she was in labor. and that she was literally birthing her soul into her next expression. And that gave me such a broader dimension on death and dying and what comes next. Because prior to that, we can do releasing prayers with people who are on their way out and essentially give them permission. We can just gently be with them and sort of be an earthly guide. I used to think that was important. And then I listened to myself when I was sitting with a congregant, a friend, a dying patient, and I was saying, it's okay to go. You can let go. Just ease and grace, nice and easy. And I heard myself saying that repeatedly and being present with him and sitting with him. And all of a sudden, this voice in my head is like, who are you to tell this guy what to do? This is his process. This is his soul journey. Not up to me to hurry the guy out of here. So I don't do that anymore. I just witness the process of the birthing. I think you were with me, Conrad. When we were in the ministerial education program, I opted for the hospice practicum. It was a term where we traveled with Kansas City hospice chaplains to visit patients. And I learned something very important there. What to say. I love you. I know you love me. I love you. I know you love me. I forgive you. I know you forgive me. I'll be okay. I'll be okay. I release you. Death is not eternal. Life is. And we are never, never separate from Source. Life and death are not absolute beginnings and endings. They're continuous transformations. I invite a moment of stillness, and if you're comfortable closing your eyes, I would like to share a reading from Thich Nhat Hanh's journal. The day my mother died, I wrote in my journal, "A serious misfortune of my life has arrived. I suffered for more than 1 year after the passing away of my mother. But one night in the highlands of Vietnam, I was sleeping in the hut in my hermitage. I dreamed of my mother. I saw myself sitting with her, and we were having a wonderful talk. She looked young and beautiful, her hair flowing down. It was so pleasant to sit there and talk to her as if she had never died. When I woke, it was about 2 a.m, and I felt very strongly that I had never lost my mother. The impression that my mother was still with me was very clear. I understood then that the idea of having lost my mother was just an idea. It was obvious in that moment that my mother is always alive in me. I opened the door and went outside. The entire hillside was bathed in moonlight. It was a hill covered with tea plants, and my hut was set behind the temple halfway up. Walking slowly in the moonlight through the rows of tea plants, I noticed my mother was still with me. She was the moonlight caressing me as she had done so often. Very tender, very sweet, wonderful. Each time my feet touched the earth, I knew my mother was there with me. I knew this body was not mine, but a living continuation of my mother, my father, my grandparents, and great-grandparents, all of my ancestors. Those feet that I saw as my feet were actually our feet. Together, my mother and I were leaving footprints in the damp soil. From that moment on, the idea that I had lost my mother no longer existed. All I had to do was look at the palm of my hand, feel the breeze on my face or the earth under my feet to remember my mother is always with me, available at any time. Thich Nhat Hanh. Namaste.